I'm going to read to you from the 12th chapter of the book of Romans. I had indicated it was going to be Phillips' translation, but I have two copies somewhere. I'm not sure where they are yet. I will retranslate one verse that I wanted to get particularly out of Phillips' translation, but it's a challenge of Paul to the church at Rome to try to understand their own existence. Remember that the Roman world was a pagan world through and through, and for Christians to live in Rome, they were living in pure paganism, and they were constantly being threatened on all sides by the paganism of that world. And I appeal to you, brethren, by the mercies of God, to present your bodies as a living sacrifice, holy and acceptable to God, which is your spiritual worship. Do not be conformed to this world, but be transformed by the renewal of your mind, that you may prove what is the will of God, what is good, acceptable, and perfect. In the Phillips translation, that is said rather differently. Phillips did not do a full translation. He did a running paraphrase. And he says, don't let the world squeeze you into its mold. That is the theme for today's sermon. Do not let the world squeeze you into its mold, but be transformed by the renewal of your mind. In addition to all the other things I listed on Wednesday, during the course of the week, some other things began to develop that I thought were interesting as well. I've been frustrated as I read not only about what's going on in Iran, but as I try to reflect upon the papers and find myself asking more and more questions, that I find few people are willing to really give the energy it takes to answer questions. I received a letter from a young man, a very strange letter, regarding the letter I had sent out on abortion, a minister talking about what right I had to decide for a pregnant person. And I stopped when I read that. A pregnant person? I haven't answered the letter yet. What kind of thought process gets to the point that in the name of a humanity doesn't like the concept humanity, but can talk about a pregnant person? Strange. I laughed, and yet I anguished. Chris and I were talking at some length, and you and the Sunday school and particularly our youth group at the beginning are going to have some opportunity to reflect on some of those conversations. We had set up with the youth group beginning the Sunday after Thanksgiving for to meet with them for an hour each Sunday for a period of 6 or 7 weeks to talk about something. Now, kids love me. They're just scared to death of me. It's not me. It's every pastor. Nobody ever grows up being friendly with their pastors. There's a certain awe. There's a certain reflection. And while they may come and sit and you can put your arm around them and say, how are things going? And they smile, there's a certain separation that somehow or another gets through. And whether you want it or not, it's there. And I said the real problem of working with the kids is that the kinds of things they need to talk about, they won't talk about with any pastor that I've ever known. And Chris and I in our dialogue began to talk about thinking and moral issues and the relationship between thinking and morality. And she was reflecting upon some of the classes she's taking and how in the process of teaching children we have a tendency to teach them the opposite of what we intend. We want to correct them. And therefore, we speak out boldly when they do something wrong and fail to acknowledge that psychologically 50 good things have to happen before one bad thing is erased. So every time you say to your kid, you're a naughty boy, you ought to say 50 times just to break even, you're a lovely boy, you're a handsome boy, you're a good boy, you're doing this fine, I appreciate this, on and on and on. But how many of us do it? And we need to balance that concept with the concept of discipline. For the other end of the pole is where you say nothing to the kid about what they're doing, as though by not disciplining them, you're somehow or the other giving them a positive reinforcement. And yet the lack of discipline is every bit as harmful in the long run as the over-discipline. For the truth of the matter is, it's not discipline or lack of, it's the approach of love that makes the difference. It's the approach of thinking rather than reacting that makes the difference. It's the approach that the child knows that they are being called to account not because of some fear within the parent, but because of a love for the child. Now that's tough. Every one of us who is parents here fail miserably. Kids catch it because we're angry and we don't have any place else to put it. So we end up angry at the child and hollering or screaming or yelling or cutting off or making the child to suffer because we're suffering oftentimes, 90% of the time, for something the kid had nothing to do with, but provides the excuse. So Chris is going to meet with our senior high group for a period of weeks and reflect upon morality and the questions that teenagers are facing and how they can utilize their training and their minds to think about the answer before, not after. It's going to be exciting. I've listened to some of the things she's saying. And if you've got a teenage kid, they ought to be there starting the week after Thanksgiving to reflect with somebody who is in tune with where they are, but at the same time holds on to some new ideas that might help. And then I began to think even more and reflect a little bit. And so today's sermon has nothing to do with driving towards a conclusion or asking you to do anything except to reflect within yourself. How do you make the decisions you make? How do you reflect upon what you're doing? How do you understand what the turmoil is in the world around? On what basis do you make decisions about anything? On what basis do you understand what is happening about anything? On what basis do you decide what you're going to do? And as I try to understand, and I will ask this only question for public consumption. The rest of the questions of the day are for you within yourself. As I try to understand my entire educational career, which spans more years than I want to acknowledge, a number of fine universities, I cannot remember a single class that dealt with how to think. Have any of you ever taken a class? We have many good universities represented here. Many good schools, all kinds. Have any of you ever had a class that consciously, not in some sort of a logic philosophy, I've had that. That wasn't interested in thinking. I was interested in analysis over here. Have any of you ever had a class that said, this is the way we think, this is how we approach, these are the steps we take to reach a decision? Have you any? Isn't that amazing? It's probably accurate. Isn't that incredible? Man, the thinking animal. Man, the animal that has reached the heights of all that accounts. Man, the animal that prides himself upon his brain, doesn't take any steps at all to teach that brain how to reflect and to think. We have president's commissions on the health of the kids. We need one on the health of the brain. You know what's frustrating? The brain is not a muscle, but it functions in much the same way as a muscle. If you don't use it, it goes stale. I find it in my own self. If I get a week even, or 2 weeks, where I am not grappling with some tough problem that really upsets me in sense of I can't get an answer to it, my mind begins to go like this. I get to the point where I read, not for understanding or excitement, but to fill time. I read and I turn the pages, and if you were to say to me, what have you been reading? A what? Oh. Have you done that? And I go back and say, what have I been reading for the last hour? Because the mind, like every other aspect of life, needs to work. The spirit needs to be working and challenged and reaching out. The body needs to be working and challenged and reaching out, and the mind. And so today I would like to give you a preliminary primer approach to man, the thinking animal, the thinking process. Anytime you begin to deal with something as large as the concept of thought, you are dealing with trying to put some categories so that we can hold on to it. I am in no way, manner, shape, or form going to admit that this is the only way. In fact, I will mention 2 or 3 other ways as we go along. But one of the most helpful things for me in terms of my own living experiences, in terms trying to understand what it is that flows into the thought process and the decision making, is to recognize that the vast majority of time I don't think about what I do until after I've done it. Do you do any differently? Afterwards, I am brilliant at explaining why I did it. Another conversation of the week with daughter Shelley in psychology, talking about rationalization. And I argued rationalization is a reasonable excuse for afterwards, and she said, psychologically, it's a lie. Well, that's true, it is. Rationalization is something that I can give to you that's reasonably acceptable for my doing it, but I'm really lying to you because it probably doesn't have any relationship to the real reason I did it. And I'm lying to myself even more. And so consequently, normally I go on doing my acts until somebody catches me at it, and then they say, why'd you do that? Which is one of the most difficult questions in the world and is absolutely ensures you're not going to get an honest answer. Why you did that puts you on the defensive. I've got to have a reasonable reason. I can't say I did it because I'm stupid, or I'm dumb, or I don't know. Although I think I blew a minister's mind. I missed a meeting, which I really wasn't sure I wanted to go to anyhow. But I wrote and said, I just blew it. Sorry I wasn't there. I should have been. I just totally forgot about it. It was my fault, and there's no reason for it. Now, some psychoanalysts would go through as to why I missed the meeting, but that's... I doubt if you ever got a letter saying, I'm sorry, I just blew it like that. I'm beginning to say things like that as I grow a little bit with myself, because I do blow some things. So please, don't ever ask me, why did you do that? Because I can give you a zillion answers, none of which are true. That's the first thing I learned about myself, and I share with you because I'm not so sure you're very different than I am. If that is the case, how do we begin to become attuned to the idea of making decisions not on some sort of just, that's the way it happened, but on a reasonable approach that enables us to go step by step on the difficult problems of life? I find a great deal of wisdom in a French psychologist, anthropologist by the name of Lévi-Breuil, who wrote during the turn of the century and for the first 30 or 40 years of the century, dying in the 1950s. He tried to understand levels of thought and saw a progression and recognized that the progression and levels of thought did not mean necessarily one was a higher or better thought, but rather that one was different. For if you challenge people to say, how do you think, they will say, we are logical thinkers. And in 99% of the case, that is not true. Lévi-Breuil began working with the concept, and he came up with what has been called pre-logical, or better yet, and I like it better, protological thought. Protological thought is not logical in a number of ways because it doesn't see causal relationships. It doesn't see that A plus B equals C. You got A plus B, therefore C. What it sees is that things happen. Reflect upon your own existence. The children that you were raised with or no existence as you try to understand this. It does not have a 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 progression. Things just happen. There's a great deal of superstition involved in it. Prejudice operates on this level. Prejudice by nature is not logical. Post-prejudice becomes logical. After you decide that you don't like people with beards for whatever reason, then you begin to explain why. That's where the rationalization comes in. But prejudice, by its very nature, is prejudging, and you can't prejudge something because that's already a breaking of the logic. It operates on protological thought. There's no clear distinction between things. You will find it in some of the movements going on. Kubler-Ross, who seems to be going off the deep end in her concepts of death and dying and has lost all concept of intellectual involvement, is now moving towards what in a sense is a primeval prototype of thought. There's no logic between, no distinction between male, female, no distinction between animate, inanimate, no distinction between any of these things. It's all a constant flowing back and forth. In the ancient Egyptian and the ancient Canaanite myths, you will find gods and goddesses who are one time male and the next time female, and there's no contradiction in the eyes of the people who are worshiping at that point. You will find one time a goddess who is the loving mother of all mankind, who is slaughtering her worshippers. In one of the most gory chapters of ancient history, where this goddess comes into a closed room where the people are worshiping her and just slaughters them until the entrails and all are hanging from her ears and she is shrieking with delight. There is no concept of the things that we consider to be open and honest. And in today's world, more and more and more and more people are operating on precisely that level of thought. It is an effort to go back from the understanding of man to the gut feelings. If you go to watch a play that's modern, do you learn anything from it about the real depths and all of a human existence? Not really. Most modern plays, most modern movies, most modern effort at this is to merely regurgitate feelings. You want to be in touch with yourself. But being in touch with yourself is not necessarily a rational, understandable approach to learning about yourself. It's one of the approaches. A second level of thought, there's, by the way, at this point too, we're seeing it right now in Iran. There is no such thing as individual responsibility. It's group responsibility. That's where your kids operate it. It's not my fault. Everybody's doing it. In Iran, what are we hearing now? They got our hostages. Let's take their people hostages. The responsibility is not an individual responsibility of people who are sitting there making the decisions and holding them accountable. It's a general feeling that all Iranians are evil because of what's happening, which is already one of the prime symptoms of protological thought. It takes the last thing that's happened and sees it in terms of the cause. Come back to that in just a moment in a very interesting way. That all Iranians are evil and that the only way that you can take care of the problem is to take it out on all Iranians, any that you can find. That moves away from the concepts of the Bible, where each one is accountable for their thoughts and their ideas and their actions, and it gives it sort of a general social kind of a thing. The last thing, I wanted to come back to that because biblically this is where much operates. In the Bible, there is no understanding of the causes and relationships of pregnancy. Does that surprise you? That is a very sophisticated thought. To be able to put together a sexual act here and 9 months later the birth of a baby, but even more sophisticated because when you put together the sexual act here, it takes a period of time before the quickening, which shows for certain that the woman is pregnant. And consequently, you will find in the literature of the Bible and other places that the woman suddenly feels and says, "The Spirit of the Lord has come. This is a holy place, for here I feel." The causal relationship is not spelled out. Now, the second area is a very important area. Good Lord. That's called the area of logic in terms of experience. This is where we live for the most part. The protological thought is the thought that's the worst part of us for almost completely. There are some good things that come out of it because there are some things that help us to break through and to change our concepts. But for the most part, we live by experience. This is concrete thought. For those of you who are familiar with the psychological terminology. We learn by experience. We don't have an idea of what a tape recorder is until we actually see a tape recorder. Once we have the concrete in our hands, then we can begin to draw from that the ideas of it. It is an empirical, logical, or experienced thought that we do most of our living. For example, how to get along with other people is not a logical thing whatsoever. There's no logic to it. You can draw logic afterwards. How to get along with other people is an experience thing. You experience the relationships, and as you begin to experience the relationships and draw from them, you learn that there are certain things which are acceptable and there are certain things which are not acceptable. And the greatest tragedy of the 20th century is that we have removed all of that history of mankind and consciously turned our back on history and said we're going to throw it out and go in all new directions, only to discover, pathetically, that the history of mankind has always been going in new directions and coming back to certain basic moral, ethical teachings because they grow out of the concrete experience of life. The biblical record of truth is not only a concept of God in man, but man in man, and reflects 2,000 years of human history struggling with the problems. Law is not logical. There is no innate logic in law, except after the fact. Law grows out of the same kind of struggle and moral fighting as didactic literature, the teaching literature, the moral and religious literature. That's why you always go back to precedent. Because how did people answer it before? What was the problem that they were dealing with? That's why the biblical doctrines are so often couched in legal terminology in the Old Testament, because they are dealing with real, live situations. Nobody ever sat down and said, I am going to write a law code. What people do is they take the experiences and they put it down as a guide. Morality based on individual and not the group is an absolute experiential kind of logic. In ancient world, you would kill somebody in the opposite tribe who was in the same position as the person killed in your tribe. If it was the son of a chief, you killed the son of the chief of the opposite tribe. It didn't matter who killed him. You had to balance. An eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. Whatever was lost had to be balanced. You couldn't balance it by holding the person accountable because maybe they were a slave. Therefore, you had to balance it by the equal rank. One of the major breakthroughs is that that doesn't work. One of the major breakthroughs in morality is that you cannot balance things out. You can only hold people accountable for their actions, not somebody else accountable for what they did. We're moving away from that in rather shocking ways. We have a case, which you saw in the paper, I think it was yesterday or the day before, where the principal of a high school and the entire school district is held accountable because that principal molested a child. That is not experience. That is moving back into protological thought, into the thought that it's the group that's responsible, not the individual. It's part of the trend to get rid of the mind. And it's very effective. Early science was experiential. It was not logical. Science to this day is not logical. It's experiential. The very method called scientific method means that you have to prove out by experience what you are saying. Now, I understand there's a theoretical science that's developing. Mathematics and a number of other things are theoretical out and through here, but they become true science only at the point that they are capable of being proved. Up to that point, they are philosophy. The reason that mathematics in particular is a philosophical science is so much of it has become theoretical. But once it can be proved out, it moves into the concept of experience. And monotheism is a concept which grows out of experience. No one can worship many gods. No one can acknowledge many gods. No one can feel many gods. For a period of time, it begins to break down. As soon as you move into a logical understanding of experience, which is why this is called experiential and logical at the same time, you move away from many of the cults and ideas of our contemporary period, and yea, even many of the long-standing religions, to the concept there can only be one God. Now, some of you are going to say I'm naive and that I'm narrow and that I'm Western and I don't appreciate the many fine religious concepts to be found in other religions. And I'm going to say to you, you're right. However, one of the problems, particularly with Eastern religions, is that they do not operate on the logical at all. Islam is not operate on a logical. When you try to argue with Khomeini on the basis of logic, you are in a different ballpark talking a totally different language, because Islam is not something that you think about, meditate upon, and logically spell out. Never has been. Try to set up a dialogue between an Islamic scholar and a Christian or a Jewish scholar about the nature of the religion, and you can find no scholars who are Islamic themselves to talk with you. You can only find non-Islamic individuals who have studied, who can therefore deal with it in a logical way. So why talk about dealing with Khomeini in a logical? You're not talking about something that's there. He isn't logical in his approach. He isn't logical in what he's saying. There's no logic to anything that's going on. If you tear your hair about Mr. Khomeini and his approach, you ought to be, because you're trying to think and to understand what's happening, and it is not a logical operation at all. It is at this point that most people, the vast majority, it is difficult to give a percentage because the rest of us get all scared when we hear such things as percentages. All of us have the potential of moving beyond our experiences. Few ever do. Few ever move beyond the empirical logical. Few ever get to the point where they can begin to think about the obvious and to question it, as Alfred North Whitehead says. It requires a very unusual mind to undertake the analysis of the obvious. Few get into that formal kind of thinking pattern that doesn't go 1, 2, 3, but tries to understand that one may not be one, but could be something else, and to analyze problems. Few get to the point where they try to deal with the concepts themselves. And the few who do it are the ones who bring about change. You can see the conflict if you watch Galileo. I did not stay up last night to see the second half. I wish I could have, but it was just running too late. But last week in Galileo, here is the conflict between a man who is looking out and challenging the concepts at that time of the church, since the church was really the only place that education was taking place, and saying to them, but the concepts that you have held to be true for so long are not only not experientially true, but they don't make sense in terms of the logic, the formal. Begin to look out there and draw your concepts from what you see and then move on. The church refused to do that. And you saw the conflict that went on, and the upheavals and the pain. And yet if you ask people, most of us say we are logical beings, and that's how we do the things that we do. And the whole purpose of today's sermon is to just begin to plant some seeds of doubt. I don't want seeds of positive reinforcement. I want seeds of doubt. I want each one of us, as we reflect upon these kinds of things, to try to understand how it is that we think about religion, about our family, about society, about this government, about what's going on in the world. Do we accept the blasé kind of things that come down our way? Do we listen to the commentators on television and say, yeah, that's right, they must know because they know more than we do? Or do we